You've probably measured your height 100 times against a doorframe, on a driver's license, in a locker room, standing next to someone taller, wondering why they seem to move so differently than you. Most people think of height as a number on a wall chart. It isn't. It's a physics setting. And your body has been running on that setting since the day you stopped growing. The real answer is far stranger than tall people are just better athletes. Because at every single height, from 5 feet to 7 feet 4, a different law of physics takes over. Not a metaphor, an actual equation. And once you know which one governs your frame, you start to understand why certain sports feel like they were built for you, and others never quite click no matter how hard you train. Start small. Under 5'2", the law here is called moment of inertia, and it has nothing to do with strength. A spinning object with its mass packed close to its center turns faster than the same object with its mass spread out. Figure skaters use this every time they pull their arms in mid-spin and speed up without adding a single ounce of new force. The biomechanist Robert McNeil Alexander spent decades studying exactly this kind of scaling, how an animal size changes the physics of everything it does, not just how hard it can push, but how fast it can rotate, how efficiently it can move. A shorter frame already carries its limbs closer to its rotational center, tuck into a flip, and that body reaches a tighter shape than a taller one is physically able to reach. It isn't grit, it's geometry. This is a range that produces gymnasts who complete skills judges have to invent new scoring rules for, and jockeys who become national icons at 90 pounds soaking wet, because in that saddle, being small isn't a compromise. It's the entire job description. Move up a few inches into the 5'2" to 5'6" range, and the advantage flips from rotation to force. Here's where most gym culture gets it backwards. Everyone worships long arms and long legs like they're a cheat code, but a longer limb is a longer lever, and a longer lever needs more distance to travel before it delivers force. Sports biomechanist Dwayne Knudsen, whose textbooks are still standard reading in university kinesiology programs, breaks this down in blunt terms. Shorter levers move less mass over less distance, which means a joint can generate explosive torque without the mechanical strain that a longer limb puts on the same system. Shorter femurs and shorter arms aren't a disadvantage in strength sports. They're an engine built for torque instead of reach. This is a range that produces some of the highest strength-to-bodyweight ratios ever recorded, and wrestlers whose center of gravity sits so low that opponents have to move their own base first every single time just to get a grip, keep climbing to 5'7" through 5'9", and the physics shifts again, this time to inertia itself. Inertia is simply resistance to a change in motion. More mass, more resistance. A bigger, more powerful frame has to decelerate more before it can redirect. At this height, there's enough leg length to generate a real stride, but not so much mass that stopping and restarting becomes a tax. Exercise physiologist Peter Wyand, who has spent years studying the biomechanics of sprinting and directional change, has shown again and again that raw size isn't what makes an athlete explosive. It's how quickly force can be applied and removed from the ground. That's why the most unguardable players in certain sports aren't the tallest ones on the field. They're the ones whose whole body can change direction before a bigger opponent even finishes decelerating from the last step. Bigger isn't slower on paper. It's slower in the split second that actually decides the play. Somewhere between 5'10" and 6'1", something unusual happens. The body stops specializing. Biologists call this kind of arrangement a balanced optimum, a system tuned not for one extreme, but for the widest possible range of output. At this height, the cardiovascular system isn't straining to push blood to distant extremities the way it does in much taller frames, but there's still enough limb length for real reach and real stride power. Joints sit in a load range that tolerates both explosive effort and sustained endurance without breaking down season after season. This is why the sports that demand strength, speed, endurance, and precision all at once tend to be dominated by athletes in this exact window. It doesn't look like a superpower. It just looks like everything working at the same time for a very long career. That's not luck. That's the range evolution seems to have settled on as its default setting for humans, and it's exactly why it gets overlooked. Nobody notices the engine that never breaks down. Push past 6'2", and the conversation changes entirely, from balance to extension. This is where a strange little ratio comes into play called the ape index, the relationship between your wingspan and your height. Most people sit close to 1-to-1, arms out matching height almost exactly. Past 6'2", that ratio frequently tips past even, sometimes by a significant margin. In water, that extra reach isn't decoration. A longer arm enters the water farther ahead, pulls a larger volume with each stroke, and covers more distance per movement, which means fewer total strokes and less wasted energy across a race. Robert McNeil Alexander's scaling research applies here too. Longer limbs change not just how far you can reach, but how efficiently that reach converts into forward motion. Go check your own wingspan against your height right now. You might be surprised which side of the ratio you land on. From 6'4" to 6'7", extension turns into acceleration, and the physics gets genuinely dangerous. Kinetic energy scales with mass, but it scales with the square velocity. Double the mass of a strike, and you double its energy. Double the speed, and you quadruple it. A longer arm gives a strike more distance to accelerate before contact, and more distance to accelerate means more velocity at the moment of impact. This is sometimes called the whip effect, the same reason the tip of a long lever moves faster than the tip of a short one under identical rotational force at the joint. It's why heavyweight boxing has been dominated for generations by fighters in this range, and why some of the most durable arms in football history belong to quarterbacks who didn't need to twist their whole body to generate velocity on a throw. The extra length wasn't for looks. It was a runway. From 6'8" up through 6'10", the physics rotates 90 degrees, from force moving outward to force moving upward. This is potential energy, stored energy tied directly to how high your mass already sits before you ever leave the ground. A center of gravity that starts elevated has to travel a shorter relative distance to reach the same effective peak height as a shorter athlete jumping at full extension. Combine that with a skeletal frame that spreads landing and takeoff forces across longer bones and larger joint surfaces, and you get athletes who can generate explosive vertical output game after game, year after year, with less cumulative wear than the raw numbers would suggest. In sports built around finishing above the rim, that combination of standing reach and jumping economy makes certain players nearly impossible to contest at the peak of their motion. Somebody else is still rising. They're already coming back down, ball in hand. Decision already made. And then there's the tier past 6'11", where the physics stops being a tool an athlete uses and becomes something opponents simply have to build their entire strategy around. The concept here doesn't have a catchy one-word name because it's not really a technique. It's total physical occlusion. A standard shot, a standard pass, a standard angle of attack. All of it is engineered around the assumption of a normal-sized obstacle in the way. Against a frame with an 8-foot wingspan that barely has to leave the ground, the whole equation breaks. The shooter has to raise the arc, slow the release, shift their entire mechanic, all under pressure, all before the ball even leaves their hand. Nobody blocked the shot. The shot was edited before it existed. 8 ranges of height. 8 completely different physics profiles, none of them better than the others, just governed by different laws. The pivot giants own rotation. The leverage specialists own torque. The agility architects own inertia. The all-rounders own balance. The propulsion engines own extension. The kinetic strikers own velocity. The vertical dominators own potential energy. And the tallest among us don't own a technique at all. They own the space itself. You still measure your height against a doorframe. But now, you know it was never really a number. It was a physics setting you've been running on your whole life. And the only real question left is how many of the advantages you've actually figured out you have.